So yeah, as I said, now we're going to start our discussion of the third phase of the startup life cycle, which is the phase where now you finally actually start focusing on aggressively scaling your business. And it makes sense to start aggressively scaling at this stage because in ideal circumstances, you know you have something that people want, you know who that target customer is, and you have a predictable, repeatable, and monetizable way to get those customers, right? So once you've figured out all that stuff, you might as well try to do customer acquisition as quickly as is, reasonably justifiable, right? And so that's really what this phase is about, right? In terms of kind of broad discussion of the phase, I'm going to talk a little bit about this phase in two dimensions. One of the dimensions is going to be the timing. So basically, when do you actually enter the scaling aggressively phase? Now, if you guys have viewed my video that was from a non-live recording that I posted last week on unit economics, you'll see that we had kind of translated the question of whether you're ready to scale aggressively into a pretty focused NPV problem, right? And specifically, it was an NPV problem at the customer level, right? So you start with a customer lead. It could be a site visit to your company webpage coming from Google AdWords, for instance. You pay careful attention. How much does that lead cost you? And you follow that lead in the customer acquisition funnel, right? You figure out, well, how many of those leads that you paid, Google for actually result in this kind of customer sign up, that kind of customer sign up, so on and so forth. And then you try to figure out, well, what is the value of each of these different possible types of customers, right? And when you kind of probability weight all those values, you get a sense of, is buying this lead positive NPV, right? And so when I say like you solve phase two of the startup life cycle, right? So you reach go-to-market fit. What I mean is you have that attractive unit economics, right? Customer acquisition is firmly positive NPV, right? So in an ideal context, you've kind of solved that at this stage when you start growing aggressively. We will see that there's going to be a caveat to this statement. So there are going to be some cases where you start scaling aggressively, so you enter phase three even before you've solved phase two. And I'm going to give you guys, I think, relatively clear guidance on when something like that is justifiable versus not. So that we will discuss. But it's useful to kind of think about why is it that we want our leads to be sufficiently profitable? Because one of the other things that I said in my video on unit economics, my introductory video, was that you don't just want to use a zero NPV rule, right? So you don't look at the NPV of a lead and say, if bigger or equal to zero, scale aggressively. You want to have a margin of safety above the NPV of zero. And there's a few reasons for this. So it's useful to discuss this at a high level. And one of the reasons for this is if you actually looked at the unit economics example that we did, one way to think about unit economics is it's the marginal value of getting a new customer, right? But remember, what is the value of the firm? It's the sum of all the marginal values of the customers, but we should also subtract the fixed costs, which don't show up in marginal calculations, right? So you'll notice when I did my unit economics example in the video, I didn't include any fixed costs for the company in my NPV, right? But if you want to actually build a valuable company, it's not sufficient for you to just be marginally profitable. You need to make enough profits at the margin to offset fixed costs. And so that's one of the reasons why NPV close to zero just won't cut it, right? So it needs to be sufficiently above. It's not the only reason, right? So, other reasons is, look, we've figured out how to have profitable customer acquisition in phase two, but we were doing that kind of customer acquisition in a smaller scale when we're in phase 2. And when we start ramping it up, it's quite possible that our unit economics are going to erode. They're going to get worse. I mean, one reason that they might get worse is that as we try getting more and more customers, we have to start reaching for the tougher and tougher customers to acquire, right? If some customers are easy to get and some customers are harder to get, which ones should we try to get first? We should try to get the easy ones first, right? And so if we've been doing phase 2, going for the easy customers, but we know once we start scaling aggressively, we're going to have to kind of start trying to reach for the tougher customers. Our unit economics are going to get worse, right? Because we're going to have a lower conversion probability. Maybe we're going to have to, if we have a sales-driven process, have to contact the potential lead more times before they become a customer, and things like that, right? So that's another reason why you want to be a margin above 0 NPV when you ideally enter this aggressive scaling phase. Third reason, by the way, my ordering, the order at which I'm saying the reasons doesn't exactly match with my slides. So just make sure you hear what I say and find which of the 4 reasons I'm mentioning. So sorry about that. But another reason is competitive pressure, right? Because, look, once a company starts aggressively scaling, like the market is going to notice. And when the market notices, other companies are going to try to do the same thing as this company, right? And one of the things that happens in at least some markets when that happens is that people are going to compete on price. Margins are going to go down. Obviously, if margins go down, unit economics get worse. Right? And then there are other reasons as well. Just going from scaling at a moderate pace, which is kind of what you're doing in phase 2, to going and pushing the pedal to the metal, scaling super fast. There's just a bunch of scaling constraints that start to happen, right? It's not easy to go from 0 to 100 in 3.2 seconds or something, right? That's true with cars, I think. And it's true with businesses. So when you start actually scaling super rapidly, there's a bunch of things that start to become, at least early on, potentially inefficient. And those things will hurt your unit economics as well. These are all reasons to kind of think, again, at a big picture, it's reasons to think about why, when you're thinking about whether you've solved phase 2 or not, right? You want to have an NPV of a lead that is not just a little bit above 0. You want it to be like sufficiently above 0. And I will post a video a little bit later where I give you guys some guidance on what sufficiently above 0 actually means. So I'll give you guys some guidance on it. It's going to be a short video. I just haven't posted it yet. Sound good? Right? So this is the ideal timing, right? The ideal timing is start phase 3 when you're done with phase 2, where phase 2 is defined as being done when the NPV of your lead is sufficiently above 0, right? Now, in addition to this timing, there's also this question of pacing, right? So how aggressive do you want to be with your pacing in phase 3, right? Do you have something, let's say in your experimental go-to-market campaign, phase 2, you were spending $10,000 a month on a particular go-to-market channel. Well, when you figure it out like this works, do you increase the spending to $50,000 a month or $500,000 a month, right? How quickly do you ramp that up? There's this question of pacing, right? Or like degree of aggressiveness, right? And sometimes there's going to be some practical constraints that limit your ability to scale as rapidly as the market of your customers might be willing to accommodate. I'll give actually a specific example where that was the case during today's lecture. Another question, and this relates to the earlier bullet point on timing, is I just described the ideal timing in the first half of my slide, right? But sometimes you're going to want to start early. And we're going to think about what are the conditions that govern a logical, rational justification for scaling aggressively before you've hashed out your unit economics. Okay, so I'll defer that discussion for a couple of slides, but we will talk about it, and I'm going to give, as I said, relatively clear guidance, but it's going to be related to the notion of a winner takes all market. So again, more details on this shortly. The other thing that I want to emphasize about phase 3 of the startup lifecycle is that it's still an experimental stage. So when I think about phase 3 of the startup lifecycle, I actually start to think that a startup actually kind of changes fundamentally. And in fact, a lot of people like to use the lingo that once you enter phase 3, you're no longer a startup, you're a scale up, right? A scale up is not the same thing as a mature company, but it's not the same thing as a startup. And one of the reasons that it's kind of different to both of those is it's actually kind of trying to do two things well at this stage. One is execution focused, and the other is experimentation focused, right? Because think about what happened in phase 2. Phase 2, you solved go-to-market fit, right? But you didn't solve every go-to-market fit because companies have more than one go-to-market strategy, right? You have one strategy for go-to-market via, Facebook. You have another go-to-market strategy for go-to-market on Google. These are all different things because they're different customer acquisition funnels, right? So when you're ready to enter phase 3, it's not like you've conquered every phase 2 imaginable, right? So you don't just magically all of a sudden have every go-to-market strategy that you will ever have. You have one or a few that you've figured out. You start doing those well. But if you want to grow as large as you can possibly grow, you want to find additional go-to-market strategies, correct? Right? And so one thing that happens in phase 3 is that you're still incorporating an element of experimentation in your business, because you're trying to penetrate the market in the go-to-market strategies that you've validated, but you're still trying to find other opportunities to expand your market, right? So one part of phase 3 is still focused on experimentation because you want to expand your market as wide as possible. And that market expansion part of your business is still, as I said, experimental. And the way that I like to think about the expansion phase is it's about discovering what else works. And that involves doing a miniature version of phase 1 and phase 2 all over again for your business, right? So, let me give an example, right? So maybe you sell a product or service and you figured out the right go-to-market strategy or a effective go-to-market strategy for that product or service in Canada, right? So you start doing, execution on that go-to-market strategy as much as you can in Canada, but you want to expand further than Canada. So you start saying, well, in addition to executing on that, let me go to try to figure out how I would do attractive go-to-market in the US, right? So let me try to figure out the US market. Now, because the US market is not identical to the Canadian market, it's not like you should be naive and say, oh, I'll just do the same thing that I'm doing in Canada. That could potentially be reckless, right? Because again, what works in one region doesn't necessarily work in another, right? So you need to actually still experiment a little bit in the US before you go too aggressive in the US. Another example of an expansion would be not geographic expansion, right? But would be product expansion. You sell product 1, it's natural for you to also produce product 2, given your technological, expertise derived from having developed product 1, right? So you start, developing product 2 and trying to figure out how to go to market with that product. The way a phase 3 kind of evolves is actually kind of more cyclical than what we had with phase 1 and phase 2, because I think you can maybe see a little bit with what I'm saying that these go-to-market strategies and executing on them are going to be kind of like waves, right? I've first solved go-to-market fit. I'm now a scale up, but I'm doing things in my core product in Canada. Now I want to do an expansion beyond that to the US. So I'll be doing a mini phase 1 and phase 2 to try to figure out the US with this product. If that works, I'm going to then go and do another wave of expansion where I'm going to try to figure out, let's say, how to expand to Europe or how to add that second product category. It happens in waves like this, right? And so actually, because of that, what you see with phase 3 of the startup lifecycle, more so than what we generally think of as phase 1 and phase 2, is that there ends up being many rounds of funding in the aggressive scaling phase. Because when you raise your first round of funding in the aggressive scaling phase, it's usually with a pretty specific eye on what you want to accomplish. And generally your goal is to accomplish 2 things: penetrate the go-to-market strategy, like the market that your currently validated go-to-market strategy like tackles, and figure out a new expansion. So oftentimes a startup at this phase is kind of iron focused at doing 2 things at once: executing market penetration style on what they've already validated works, and try to discover usually one other thing that works. Like literally there could be hundreds of different things that might work. You generally focus on one, because or else you're just kind of scattered too broad and you probably will do everything badly, right? And so generally, actually, even when you raise a funding round, that's actually really clearly communicated with your investors as a startup. Is like, our goal is to do this in terms of market penetration and to do that in terms of market expansion, right? But you can see now, like, the company is going to become more complicated, right? It's going to become more complicated because now you're doing 2 fundamentally different things. You're doing an experimentation thing and you're doing an execution thing. Now with the execution thing, you see variation in kind of how much you try to perfect your execution process. So I like to make a distinction between like a regular aggressive scaling, where you're doing aggressive scaling after you've validated unit economics. So you actually did finish phase 2. You kind of have something that works, and your goal is to start doing it and to actually try to make that process as marginally profitable as possible. So that's usually for startups like that, there's a focus on kind of tightening up the organization and trying to create as many efficiencies as possible. I'm actually going to contrast that a little bit. And again, we're going to talk about this. We're going to continue talking about this when we talk about the timing of aggressive scaling. But there are some settings where companies are growing super rapidly. But if you actually look at the operations in the company, it's really chaotic. And it's very clear that the company is not trying to perfect everything. I call this like triage, right? You're trying to contain problems as opposed to trying to do everything perfectly. And it'll be kind of clear logically why you end up doing more of a triage approach. For these other companies, which I'm going to refer to as Blitzscaling companies, these are companies that start scaling aggressively before they've hashed out their unit economics. So we're going to really want to think about these companies and these companies as being very different. And again, I'm going to characterize what I view and what many practitioners view as being the core differences between companies that might fall into this category versus those that should not and should wait for their unit economics to be relatively settled and attractive before they start aggressively scaling. But are folks okay with this? Like, it's really, you're thinking of a company that has 2 personalities at this stage, right? It's got the element of being, to varying degrees, execution focused on something that works, ideally, like a mature company. And it's got an element of discovering new things that work, experimental style, like a startup. So it actually is kind of a bit of both. Folks okay with this?
I just have a quick question before you move on, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. So you talked about, when you raise the funding round, you kind of have 2 things in mind, that experimental side, but also the actual execution of the go-to-market fit that you've just discovered. I was wondering how far out in advance, like obviously you don't start raising the fund do you start raising the fund once you found go-to-market fit, or how far out in advance do you raise it so that when you find it, you can like start doing it immediately?
I don't think there's a hard and fast rule on that. And I think it'll boil down to a combination of things. So the question that Mike was asking is, like, because it takes time to raise funding, it's not like you solve go-to-market fit, 2 seconds later, you've got your venture funding, right? And so like these things can take time, and it'll vary from area to area. So like in the Bay Area, you can actually go from pitching to getting your funding round surprisingly quick, especially in the early funding rounds, like phase 1 and phase 2, but also like the early phase 3 rounds, right? So if you can turn over pretty quickly, this becomes less of an important concern. But in settings where it might take a few months or like half a year to go from pitching something good to closing a round on something good, then actually you might want to think, do I want to start a little bit early? So the answer is kind of a few things. One is like founders are starting to at least inform VCs about how they're doing so that when things are validated, they can move quicker rather than slower. They're doing that all the time. So if you talk to the founder of a startup, they're going to tell you some non-negligible portion of their time, even after they've raised the funding round, just after, is still devoted to networking with the VCs, right? It's so that they can make this happen quicker when it needs to happen. So that's going to be one of the aspects of things. That's something that allows us to maybe avoid your concern a bit, right? The other thing is, yes, sometimes founders are going to raise funding for their first phase 3 round before they solved phase 2 because they're worried about the thing that you mentioned. In what scenarios is that going to happen? I mean, this is going to depend on a few different things, right? It's going to depend on, are you running out of money? If you're running out of money, you don't have the luxury to try to solve out phase 2 because you need money to actually even get there. So if you're like runway, the amount of time you can continue to burn the money you're burning before you run out of money is starting to get short, then you're starting to try to raise before you've solved phase 2. That's one. 2, it's probably related to just how aggressive the founder wants to be, right? So like, and what aggressive means will kind of depend on market conditions. So if market conditions are kind of cold, right? So that like, that if you raise before you raise a phase 2, you're going to have to dilute yourself a lot, you as a founder. Then you might just actually try to push it to the edge as an aggressive founder. Be like, look, we've got 6 months of runway left. Let's just see if we can solve this in the next 3 months instead of just raising now at unfavorable terms. So an aggressive founder might kind of push it to the edge. Meanwhile, an aggressive founder in other settings where the market is hot and right now you can raise at attractive terms, they might say, screw it, let's just go raise a bunch of money now, even though we're not really ready for that amount of money yet, right? So you'll see those kinds of considerations as well. So there's a lot of things that come into play, and I suspect that you won't get a homogeneous answer across different founders, across different market conditions, and across different levels of financial health for startups. So I don't think it's not a one size fits all thing, but it's definitely, you're asking a question that definitely startups ask themselves, if they know what they're doing, because it is a choice variable for sure. Okay. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about the synchronicity of like phase of the life cycle and funding rounds a little bit later when we're talking about the funding life cycle. So I will revisit that. But now what I want to do is I want to go back to this question that I've alluded to a couple of times already, which is, do you want to wait for the ideal timing to scale aggressively, i.e. when you've solved phase 2? Or do you want to jump in and start solving start tackling phase 3, aggressive scaling, before you've actually validated attractive unit economics? And this strategy of scaling rapidly before you've shown marginal profitability in customer acquisition That strategy is actually given a very specific term by practitioners. The term is called Blitzscaling. So the term itself was popularized by this fellow right here. So this is Reid Hoffman. He's currently a VC at Greylock, yet another prominent Bay Area VC fund. But Reid is best known for being the founder of LinkedIn. He was also part of the key executive team at PayPal, stuff like that. But LinkedIn, we're going to see, was an example of one of these companies where blitzscaling was the really rational thing to do. So he has kind of like thought leadership and like pretty rare expertise in navigating a business where blitzscaling was very important to basically end up being a winner in his startups market, right? Because I think all of us know that within their vertical of, let's call it social media, I don't know if we want to exactly categorize it in that way. In his vertical, in that vertical, LinkedIn is the champion, right? That seems pretty clear. So he's popularized the notion of thinking carefully when you want to do this kind of, do phase 3 before you've solved phase 2. I mean, in fact, Reid teaches an entire class that's a whole quarter long at Stanford, specifically on this subject, right? So we're not going to do justice to every little nuance of blitzscaling. I want to just give you guys a high level overview of like the most important, what I view to be the most important considerations and the most important logical justifications for why you would blitzscale in practice. Blitzscale is kind of like a buzzword at this stage, at least among people who are embedded in startup ecosystems. So there is a bit of tendency right now for startup founders to think they've got a business that justifies blitzscaling when they do not. I mean, it's kind of nice to be able to say that like you should blitzscale, right? Because it says, hey, you can go to level 2 before you've done the hard work to solve level. So you can go to level 3 before you've done the hard work to solve level 2. Right? Like to some people, this seems like a nice thing to be able to do. And a lot of founders think that they can do it. And that's really not the case. It is important to think about in which environments blitzscaling makes sense. Okay? Now, there's a reason to think that blitzscaling makes no sense, which is, by definition, if you have not solved phase 2, essentially either each customer you get has negative NPV, or it's too small of a positive NPV that it's hanging on a thread. If things get a bit worse, you're down to negative NPV, right? Like if you have not solved phase 2, one of those two statements that I just made is true. And so there does seem to be something reckless about it, right? There does seem to be, I mean, again, let's take the more canonical case, which is like you have negative NPV of a lead. Like it seems like a bad idea to scale that, in normal circumstances, right? If I tell you, hey guys, I've got this amazing business. Everyone wants to be my customer. I am selling these things. They're called dollar bills. I'm selling them for a quarter, and like quarters are rolling in, right? If I told you that, you'd be like, what the hell is wrong with you, Jiro, right? So obviously that makes no sense, right? But like negative unit economics has a bit of that similar feel, right? So then the question actually should not be, when does it not make sense to blitzscale? Actually, the burden is more on the blitzscaler. What could possibly justify blitzscaling, right? And in my view, and I think it's a view that's also held by most practitioners, like it makes sense to do that if you think your unit economics are going to get better in the future. And let's add another condition. And you think the only way they can get better in the future is if you scale rapidly enough now. So that the only way for you to get to those attractive unit economics in the future is to kind of bite the bullet today and grow at a loss right now. Right? That starts to now logically make sense, right? If I need to scale today, despite the losses, in order to get positive unit economics in the future, and there's going to be enough of those positive economic people in the future for me, then it may actually be making sense for me to expand at a loss today, right? I mean, that's a pretty tight logic, I think, right? So now the question is, I've just explained the logic in an abstract sense, right? I said, if you have to take the losses today to make the gains tomorrow, then you can justify it. But I haven't given you guys some concrete sense of when in the world that might occur on planet Earth, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate, I think, the most credible instance where something like that actually happens. And basically this hinges on two things, kind of two sets of things happening in your startup's market and in I guess the economy or something like that. One is about the role of competition and your market. So that's going to be one category of thing. I've got two sides to the slide, left side, right side. Role of competition and market, perhaps unsurprisingly, left part of my slide. Right part of my slide is going to be the second thing, which is going to be the role of the funding environment. And you'll need specific things to arise on both of those fronts in order to potentially justify blitzscaling at a logical level. So first, let's talk about the role of competition and the market. So I'm going to make a statement. It seems basically tautological to me, but like, you generally only want to blitzscale if you have to, right? I'm not going to get into the detail of this, but for instance, if you look at Airbnb, they went into blitzscaling mode in Europe. Maybe it was also partially in the US as well, come to think of it. But they had kind of one of their kind of blitzscaling environment where they had figured things out in parts of the US, but then they started like trying to scale aggressively before they hashed out unit economics in other places in the US and also in Europe. And they only did that once a competitive threat, which was a startup started by a company called Rocket Internet. You guys may want to just do a check online on Rocket Internet. It's actually an interesting company. But in any case, interesting does not necessarily mean good. Let's be clear of that. But when Rocket Internet decided that they were going to try to do basically an Airbnb clone, that was when Airbnb was like, God damn it, we gotta scale aggressively in some of these places where we didn't intend to yet. Right? So you really only want to do something like this if you feel you absolutely have to. And what does that actually mean? To me, it means that there needs to be a couple of conditions happening. One is you need competition. If there's no current or looming competition in your market, like you don't need to blitzscale. You might as well just try to grow at a reasonable pace, not waste too many resources, and just let those positive like unit economics develop on their own as you're scaling in a progressive manner, right? So really, either current or looming competition. If your market doesn't have that, to me, extremely difficult to justify blitzscaling. So think of these as necessary conditions, right? In my opinion. Right, so that's about competition. What about the market? The market really needs to be a market that we think has, generally speaking, a winner takes all flavor. Now, I don't mean that there's only going to be one company in the market, but what I do mean is that the biggest company in the market is going to have substantially more market share than the other companies, which is not representative of most markets, by the way, right? And so you want to think like, is your company in one of these markets where you are going to have one dominant player? Or is this a market where it's a big market, there's going to be a bunch of players with like 5 to 10% market share, right? And stuff like that. In the latter case, it doesn't make sense to blitzscale. Because the thing is, even if you don't have high market share right now, because that market is pretty diffuse, you can capture some market, like the fact that you have market share today doesn't necessarily persist into the future, right? So blitzscaling makes most sense in a market, really, which has winner takes most. We think about these markets as being first to scale markets. So that means being the first one to grow large is what makes you be, in the more long term, the dominant player in that market. Right? Remember, notice, I say first to scale, not first to enter. Right? And so what types of markets have this first to scale, captures a disproportionate share of long-term market value? So there's two examples of businesses, and we've already talked about them before, that actually do have this flavor, which were network effects businesses like Facebook and marketplace effects businesses like Airbnb, right? Why are these markets where first to scale is so important? It's because the value of your product or service depends on how many customers you have effectively, right? Well, the moment you have way more customers than everyone else, you're offering a better product than everyone else in a way that they're not able to duplicate, right? I'm sure a bunch of people have had the brilliant idea, I'm going to make a new version of Facebook, right? But no one else adopts it because they're like, do I want to, leave Facebook and go to Facebook Prime where there's no one there yet? No, it doesn't matter how much people hate Mark Zuckerberg or whatnot. I'm not saying we should or should not hate him, but right? Like, I mean, in some sense, like a Facebook can have a bunch of PR problems and they're not losing their customers. That says something, right? It says something about the strength of a network effect, right? And so I view this almost as a necessary condition. Does your market have a first to scale is kind of the winner feel to it? Two usual suspects, marketplace effects and network effects. There are other examples. So like if you've got a company, if you've got a market that's going to have a huge branding effect, right? And like brand value is going to be in a very dominant way captured by the first prominent player in the market. I don't know how common that kind of market is, by the way, because I'm no branding expert. But if you have something like that, that could maybe justify a blitzscaling as well. Folks okay with this? Right? And again, like it logically makes sense that having this like first to scale feature in the market being important. Because if you don't need to be the first to scale to end up dominating a market in the long run, why be in such a rush to scale? Right? Because remember, blitzscaling is like, I am in a huge rush to scale. I'm in such a rush that I'm willing to be burning dollar bills for a quarter a large number of times, right? That's a rush. It only makes sense if you need to rush. So far, so good, right? So then the final thing that I'm going to talk about with regards to blitzscaling is the role of the funding environment. And to me, there's like two versions of market conditions that would justify blitzscaling on the funding side of things. One is you've got a hot funding market. Now, hot funding market is not a formal definition, and it's kind of, one of these things I wouldn't be able to write to you a quantitative set of conditions that would just say this market is hot versus not. But a hot market means there's a lot of capital available in the market and that it's possible to raise more money in the future, even if you're not showing profits yet. Now, why might that be important? Because look, if you're going to be raising a lot of money today to fund huge losses today, there's actually a reasonable chance you're going to burn through that money in record time and still not have figured out your unit economics once you're running out of money. And if you're not going to be able to raise money again, you've basically made yourself a legend, but in a negative way, right? You don't want that. You want to have that like hedge where like you spend aggressively today, you still think like, I'll probably be able to raise another funding round, even if I'm still burning money like at a very high rate, right? So, you want kind of maybe that aspect. You want to feel confident that you can raise more money in the future, even if you don't, quickly solve your unit economics after you start scaling aggressively, right? And by the way, you see plenty of companies where that's happened. Plenty of companies raised multiple rounds of aggressive scaling capital while never showing profits, right? So there are scenarios where you're able to do it, right? But you want to just ask yourself, do I think I'm in this scenario? Because if you're not, it can get ugly, right? Look, the other one, right? So that's a setting where I say the funding market is such that even if you don't solve the problem, you'll still be able to raise money. The other funding market condition where it might be okay to go a bit early, I think relates to Mike's question actually, right? So your question was like, might you want to raise a bit early because you know you're almost there, but you don't want to have to like, you know, wait 6 months after you're there to have the money in the bank, right? That's kind of like requirement 3v2 on my slide. It's like you're close to solving the problem. You're pretty sure that in a few months you'll be there. So you might as well just raise the money because you don't think it's likely that you'll you'll have the shit hits the fan scenario, right? So, and in fact, I would say if you're like super, super close and you are confident that you're trending in the right direction, you might not even necessarily need requirement 1 or requirement 2. But that's like blitzscaling in all small cap letters. It's kind of like the wimpy version of blitzscaling. Usually when we talk about blitzscaling, it's like, you know, all capital letters, right? Like blitz is a pretty aggressive word, right? So it's usually not that, like most scenarios where we talk about it, we're not really referencing this, but in principle, given the way that I defined it, we could have this scenario. Make sense? Again, I do want to reiterate one thing that I hinted to about a minute ago, which is there's one thing that happens with blitzscaling companies, which is like blitzscaling companies are the companies where future outcomes are the most volatile. Because when they succeed mega. And when they don't succeed, it is like a disaster. Because think about it, when you're blitzscaling, you're losing money on every transaction and you're doing it as quickly as you can, right? That's a recipe for losing a lot of money, right? So I think like almost in both situations in the future, you create a legend. The only question is whether the legend is good or the legend is bad. Folks okay with this? So again, I have in my slides, I have a link to a blog post where Reid Hoffman talks about blitzscaling. Again, I actually put a lot of weight on what he says about blitzscaling because he really is the person, as I said, who popularized the strategy, A, and B, who executed on it successfully via LinkedIn. So I think he's a great practitioner specifically for stuff like that. You know, I did post a list of practitioners that I keep track of on my courses, both on the investor side and on the operator side. One thing I'll add, maybe I hinted a little bit in my comments that I put for every source, but I am very methodical about what I want to learn from different people. So I do try to size up, like Reid is going to has like a lot of expertise specifically on this idea of blitzscaling, right? So with him, I pay a lot of attention on all the things related to companies when you're doing aggressive scaling in these like triage type environments. Anything he says about that, I am listening big time. Right? Meanwhile, different practitioners, it's going to be different things. So for instance, we have another Reid here where Reid is spelled slightly differently. This is Reid Hastings. He's the founder. I think he's still the CEO of Netflix, but I'm not 100% sure. Right? So he's also a person who's a wonderful thought leader on operator side stuff for startups. But I view him as being someone that I learn about very different things. So I won't get into this in this class, but like, with Reid Hoffman, I pay a lot of attention to hiring and how hiring impacts how you want to manage culture in a company. Okay? If anyone is ever interested in this, we can talk about it in an office hour or something. It's not sufficiently important to discuss in detail here. But I do try to pay attention. You don't want to ask me every question in the world and hope to get a useful answer because literally 99.999% of questions I'm useless to you, right? like you want to do that with everyone, no matter how famous they are, right? So you want to do it with not famous people like me, and you want to do it with famous people like the two Reeds, because everyone has domains of expertise. Here I have a video where Reed Hastings is giving a guest lecture in Reid Hoffman's Blitzscaling class at Stanford. So just click on it. It's going to open the YouTube video. It's going to go exactly to the segment of the video that's related to this topic. And he talks about why Netflix was not a blitzscaling company, right? So I won't go into those details here. It's like a 5 to 10 minute video. So if you guys are interested in that stuff, like just take a look at that video. I think it's actually pretty good. But what I do want to do next in terms of discussing a specific example is I want to discuss an example where we had a market that did justify blitzscaling and highlight how the blitzscaler won as opposed to the first to enter. And the market I'm going to focus on is the ride-sharing market that I'm sure we all know and at least at some point in time we're using. Right, so I'm talking about Uber, I'm talking about Lyft, I'm talking about Sidecar, which I know all of you guys know about. So let me talk a little bit about the ride-sharing market in its beginnings. So the competitive landscape in the ride-sharing market, it started really in San Francisco. And in 2012, there were 3 players that were either in this market or at the periphery of the market. 2 of them we definitely know, Uber, Lyft. Lyft at the time was known as a company called Zimride. And then there was this company called Sidecar. And let me tell you a little bit, in a nutshell, what each of these companies did. So Uber was not the Uber that we know today. They were on demand, like more luxury kind of black SUV car type things. They were focused on local rides, still like today. You ordered the cars on your smartphone. But they basically contracted out with the black car riders. So one side of the market, they kind of controlled themselves, right? So it wasn't like, right now where anyone can sign up as a rider. They actually hired people to be the supply side of the market. And they were focused on getting the demand side of the market. So again, the company has evolved since then, but this is what Uber started out as. Meanwhile, Lyft was carpooling for long distance ride sharing. So instead of local rides, it was long distance ride. They principally licensed their technology to universities so that students at the universities could basically drive back home together. Again, not what they're doing now. Let's be clear, right? Meanwhile, Sidecar, which I'm guessing most of you guys haven't heard about, was actually the closest thing to what we see in this market today, which was on-demand local ride sharing, also using the smartphone like Uber, right? It's the closest thing to the eventual market. And because of that, I view Sidecar as the first to enter in the ride-sharing market. They were the first to enter. But Uber and Lyft both ended up entering this market. They just entered after Sidecar. So now let's go to this question, to blitzscale or not to blitzscale. Sidecar deliberately decided not to blitzscale. They were slow to scale. There was actually a specific reason for that. They were worried actually about taxi regulations. And because they were worried about taxi regulations, they didn't want to be classified as a taxi service. And so they did a bunch of things that would make it clear that they're not a taxi service, so that no payments could happen on their app, for instance. Which, by the way, if you had to physically give the money to the person giving you a ride, you might find the experience less enjoyable, right? And the other side, the supply side, is probably worried, what if the person just refuses to pay me? I mean, principle could happen, right? Integrating payments into the transaction flow was actually quite important for the user experience in these markets, I think, right? So basically everything with them was tip payment based as opposed to on the app. They also stayed in beta too long. So they were artificially restricting entry into their market. So this is the opposite of blitzscaling. They were being too conservative. And we know Lyft and especially Uber, those companies went pedal to the metal, right? Pedal to the metal so much that like they didn't really seem to care what taxi regulations were, right? Whether or not they were in technical violation of the law, when like community, like when I guess taxi regulators or whatnot would say you are breaking the law, they would still not listen, and they'd be like, riders, do it. If you guys get fined, we'll pay your fine. Like that's the definition of aggressive, right? And guess what? The aggressive ones won out, right? Because none of us know. I mean, how many people here actually heard of Sidecar before? If anyone who's showing video, just wave. If you didn't, say like thumbs down or something, right? So like, I think as far as I can tell, everyone where I see a thumb or a wave, like everyone was a thumb down, right? We don't hear about them because they went kaput. They got sold for like pennies on the dollar to, I think to GM or something like that, but I don't remember. Maybe it was Ford. But basically they were basically sold for their programmers. That was the asset they sold at the end. Right? And, you know, maybe one way to take a look at it is by October 2014, Sidecar had raised $35 million, which might sound like a lot until you compare to, at the same time, how much Uber and Lyft had raised, 1.5 billion and 332 million. And maybe another way to kind of think about blitzscaling is, you know, Uber is still losing money. You know how much money they ended up raising total in the private market and the public market? Like, that's like historical levels of blitzscaling. And again, let's remember, like, the delegated ride-sharing market, that is like, that falls straight in the middle, like straight in the bullseye of the conditions that I had highlighted for blitzscaling. Because there's competition in the market, and it's clearly a first to scale kind of wins the market because of the marketplace effect. If you've got service density in your region, like it's tough for someone else to come in, right? You know, you've got Uber. Who in Montreal tried to kind of come and compete against Uber? Teo Taxi. Did anyone here ever use Teo Taxi? I think I used it once because they gave me a free coupon for it, right? I think they thought that by like having the riders in a Tesla, people would want to use them. Apparently not. Ended up losing a lot of money for Quebec taxpayers. Well, small amount of money, maybe 50 million. Right? Like, look, Teo Taxi is a great example of like how strong an Uber marketplace effect is. Because trust me, like most people don't love Uber per se, right? They, again, another example of a company, terrible PR, right? But because of the marketplace effect, you know, there's not much consumers are willing to do about it. Folks okay with this? Again, this is just meant, like to me, this is just a fabulous example of an instance where blitzscaling clearly was important for eventually winning this humongous market, humongous. Okay, now I want to give you guys an example of a company that scaled too aggressively, because I also want to highlight that once you scale aggressively, and this is not blitzscaling, by the way. So this is a company, reasonable unit economics, right? But once they have it, they just kind of try to grow too fast, so that you understand that there is this question of pacing. Right? Just because your unit economics are attractive doesn't mean you do everything in the world to grow as quickly as possible, even if the target customers are there. And so actually a nice example of this is a company called Zenefits. Are people familiar with Zenefits? Yeah, so most people are not, but it's actually an interesting company. It's a company that was like extremely hot, maybe, it's kind of tough for me to tell time anymore, but like maybe 4 years ago. So maybe I'll tell you a little bit about their business. So and actually they had kind of a brilliant business idea. So that's why I like to tell this story as well. So what did Zenefits do? They built something kind of boring, which is they built great HR benefits software for mostly small, like mostly targeted to small, medium enterprise. And they would give it away for free, which was an attractive value proposition to small and medium enterprise. Now, of course, if that was the end of the story, then you'd be like, Jiro, how the hell could they have attractive unit economics? And this is actually kind of where their brilliant idea came into play, which is that they monetized their product through, I mean, this is to me coming out of left field, to be honest, through insurance brokerage fees. Because every one of their customers, small, medium enterprise, that would use their product also had another need that, at least at first glance, would have seemed kind of unrelated, which is for their small, medium enterprise insurance, they need to buy that insurance, and they basically buy it every year. And this market, you buy your insurance through a broker. Usually it's a broker you have a relationship with. And so that broker makes money from you every year. There's another interesting feature about this brokerage market, which, by the way, remember I gave you guys this example for Amazon where like we talked through all the market research that Amazon did to kind of optimize their MVP. Like Amazon is a great example. Zenefits is also a pretty damn good example of research in a market as far as I'm concerned. It's like very creative. I would have never thought about it, but the moment I heard it, I was like, damn, that's a good idea. But basically, why was this brilliant? It's basically because this market, like there's regulated commissions in this brokerage market, and in a very specific way. It's not regulated, you cannot charge more than X as commission. It's regulated not from above, but from below. You are not allowed to charge a commission of less than a certain minimum amount. So there's a minimum commission. What that does is it like kind of breaks the notion of a competitive market, right? So that like everyone who's in the market would like to lower the price so that they could get more share of the brokerage market, but they're not legally allowed. And Zenefits was like, wait a second here. Well, if we charge the same price as everyone else, but we give them this software for free, it's kind of like we lowered the price below the regulated price. And like none of these other brokerage companies can do it because they don't know jack shit about building software, right? That's actually pretty clever. And, you know, small, medium enterprise love the idea of spending money so that if, like, so not spending money, saving money, because they don't necessarily want to blitzscale. And so like for them, this idea that like, all we need to do is use them as our broker, and then we get all our HR software for free when like current vendors charge us like, God knows, like $1,000 a year. Sign me up. Everyone wanted to be like, it was an easy sell. And because it was an easy sell, I mean, Zenefits early on in their history broke all sorts of record for scaling on for a company that sells to enterprise, to other businesses, B2B. I think like basically they went from 0 to $20 million in annual revenue through their product service, like in less than 2 years. And they eventually, you know, they peaked out at a valuation in a funding round around the time that they had reached that milestone. And they peaked at like a $4.5 billion valuation, right? So this was a company that like everyone viewed as one of the most promising scale-ups in the world, full stop. Things have changed since then. They could get people as quickly, like if they got themselves in front of a potential customer and they told them the value proposition, they were able to convert pretty well. The problem was the condition that I gave at the beginning. If they were able to get a person in front of the potential customer to do the sales transaction. And the problem there is there's also laws around that. The law says you need to be a licensed broker to sell insurance. And getting someone licensed takes time. Zenefits felt like they didn't want to wait that long. And so I kid you not, the CEO of the company, a lot of the licensing stuff happened online. So you had to like view a bunch of videos, you answer a bunch of questions, and then take an exam. It turns out the exam was easy enough that you didn't need to watch all the videos. Hopefully you guys don't feel that way about this course, but in any case. And so basically the founder of this company, Conrad Parker, basically wrote a bot that would simulate a human watching the course so that someone could look as though they did the whole course while they were instead doing other work. And then they just take the exam. All they need is a C. They can get the C without doing it, without doing the course. The problem with that is that's kind of illegal. And that fraud was uncovered. So a ton of negative press around that. But there was a bigger problem, which is like regulators in the insurance market have a lot of power over the regulated companies. Because if you think about it, the insurance market kind of hinges on contracts, right? Like if I'm the brokerage company and you're my customer and I'm selling you an insurance contract, like it's quite important that that contract be enforceable, correct? Like a contract that no court will respect is not a very valuable contract. And the insurance regulator can invalidate all the contracts. So you don't want to piss off this regulator because they can completely kill your value proposition. That was the big problem that Zenefits ran into that actually Uber didn't really run into, which is that huge amount of power that the regulator had over them meant that they could not cut corners in regulation, right? So notice, another thing that I like about these two examples, it also highlights this question about whether you should navigate the murky area of regulation, because a lot of startups do that. And the answer there is not one size fits all. A company like Uber, they were able to get away with doing that. A company like Zenefits could not. And to me, it hinges on how much power the regulator has over the company. Like taxi regulators, very limited power. Because even when they say, Uber, you must stop, Uber can still continue. But the insurance regulator can say, Zenefits, we've invalidated all your contracts. And now all the Zenefits customers are like, holy crap, this insurance that we paid for is now useless. That's a much bigger problem, right? And like basically Zenefits was crushed by that, crushed. Like go do a Google search to find out what's happened in the last 4 years. Like the company has been, their valuations have been slashed multiple times. They've had multiple rounds of turnover on their executive teams, including the CEOs. They have lost a bunch of their employees. They've lost a ton of their customers. Just a disaster since. And it's really, I think most people would attribute it to the fact that they scaled too aggressively. And it's not clear that they even needed to do that. So it seems like they shot themselves in the foot because this was not your traditional Blitzscaling candidate. Folks okay with this? Again, an example, I think a good one to highlight this possibility that you do want to keep in mind in aggressive scaling, which is the possibility that you do aggressive scaling, but too aggressively. And so you want to think at a practical level, what are the constraints that exist that should be limiting how fast you run in this stage? Okay, and I gave one example here about regulation, but there's a bunch of other things. It could be hiring constraints, right? In order to deliver the product and service at a high quality, at larger scale, you need to hire more and more very good technology people, engineers, programmers, who knows, right? But it's tough to hire quickly. And so you're kind of capped at how much you can grow on the basis of how quickly you can hire the right people, right? That would be another scaling constraint, right? So you want to think about all of those things. Folks okay with that? So now what I want to do over the next 10, 14 minutes or something like that is I'll basically talk a little bit more about some of the other challenges that start to arise with startups when they enter this aggressive scaling phase. And it's important, I think, to understand some of these other challenges because they actually do give you a sense of what sort of frictions exist in fast-growing companies that do occasionally place a limiter on how quickly you can grow, okay? The first thing I'm gonna talk about is kind of at a very big picture level, what kind of at a first order level changes as you start needing to scale aggressively. And one change is about kind of the nature of roles in a startup once you go from phase 2, small experimental, to phase 3, large executional, which is that you go from having your employees being more generalist and flexible. People are jack of all trades because you don't know what you're going to need to ask them to do at different points in time, because as things change, what you want people to do changes. So you want people that can be flexible under that uncertainty, right? So employees early on, I mean, and you should keep this in mind when you're hiring for a startup early on, is you don't want the best person at doing A. You want actually someone who's quite good at doing A, B, C, D, E, and F, generalist and flexible. Meanwhile, at this stage, you've figured things out. You start wanting to have, you can now have 7 people. So you might as well have the best to do A, the best to do B, the best to do C, all the way up to the best to do, I don't know what the 7th letter of the alphabet is. It's either F or G. You can start having a bunch of specialized focus people who are going to tend to be more productive because they're specializing in that one thing. And so you get that transition in the company, right? Again, because of the benefits of specialization. But the problem is once you move to specialized and focused, right, there are things you start losing in the organization. When your organization is small and everyone is a bit involved in everything, everyone kind of knows what's up, right? And so there's less of this need to clearly communicate things among people, right? So you don't need to be worried that, like, you know, person A in the organization is going to be doing something that's totally out of sync with what person B in the organization is doing. Because guess what? They're sitting in the same room with their backs to each other, 22 hours a day, right? Well, that starts to change at this stage. And so you start running into this problem where there might be frictions in communication and coordination. You start also getting conflicts of interest within the organization as well, because the different specialized areas, don't have exactly the same economics. And so this becomes a problem that you need to manage, right? And that's one of the things that startups start to think about at this stage. And they start to think about it in a variety of different ways. I'm just going to focus on one way that they think about it, mainly in the interest of time. And because I don't know everything by a long shot. But the dimension that I'm going to focus on is organizational design. And when I say organizational design, I actually mean it in a very specific way, which is the organization of divisions. And the way that I'm going to think about the organization of divisions is going to be in the following way. Once you've got a company that's a scale up, usually they have at least a couple of products. So they're a multi-product organization. And, right, so different product categories, but they also have different functions. So that the different functions you have in the startup are going to be things like engineering, product design, sales and marketing, human resources, finance, right? And so we can think about like the company in a very granular manner as like a bunch of groups. Product 1, engineering, product 2, engineering, so on and so forth. Sales and marketing for product 1, for product 2, for product 3, right? So right here, I guess I've laid out 20 different, mini groups. The thing is, you don't want to separate all of these mini groups, because the moment groups are separated, they don't coordinate, communicate, or have similar incentives necessarily, right? So having these groups all separated is inefficient and leads to it leads to bad decisions on a variety of fronts. So you want to combine them. The problem is your organization is so large that you can't combine all of them into one clump. You have to have some separation to take advantage of the benefits of specialization. Everything I'm saying make sense so far? Well, so now we've got a problem. It's our organizational design problem, which is which of these mini groups do we want to combine together into one division, and which things do we want to have separated? And we've got some choice here because there isn't just one way to do it. I'm going to do a pretty simple and stark comparison, which is one way that we could organize divisions would be by product, right? So that we combine into one division all the functions, but for one product. Another alternative would be instead go cross-product, but within function. So put all of engineering together, put all of product together, so on and so forth, right? Those are two different choices we can make. So now the question is kind of what governs that choice? And the framework that I'm going to posit for making that choice is about minimizing the inefficiency that I just talked about. Let's think of it as like communication and coordination, so that groups that are in the same division work together better than groups that are in separate divisions. I think that's not a controversial statement. Well, whether you choose to go by function or by product should probably depend on what types of coordination are more important within your organization. Is it more important for the different functions within a product to coordinate together? Or is it more important for the different, products within engineering to work together? Again, I want to emphasize, I'm positing this as a framework because the answer will depend on the company. It's not one size fits all. Some companies, this makes more sense. Other companies, this makes more sense. So I'm going to wrap up today's class by just giving you guys an examples of two companies. One that chose to go more this way, and I'll give an explanation for why that choice made sense. And then another that chose to organize this way, along with the logical argument for why that made more sense in their case. Okay, so we'll just wrap up with that for today. Sound good? So I'll first start with an example of a company that organized by product. And I'll actually pick an example of a startup where one of the co-founders is a McGill grad, and that's a company called AppDirect. So one of the co-founders is McGill grad. The other co-founder is a Desmarais, so prominent Quebec family. Although the startup is based out of San Francisco now, and by all appearances, they're not public yet, but by all appearances, it looks like they're doing spectacularly well. Does anyone know what AppDirect does? So AppDirect builds basically app stores for other companies. So there are companies, especially the early target market was companies in telecommunications, right? So think of like Bell, Deutsche Telekom and stuff like that. Well, if you think about those businesses, they've got customers, right? And they've got customers who would like to buy software. And so AppDirect had this idea that like each of those companies should have their own app store. The app store shouldn't just be something that Apple or like Google or stuff like that run, right? Because these large telecommunication companies have access and data on a customer base. They could sell to them too and make some more money. But those companies are not specialists in building an app store. Why don't we become the outsourcing solution for building an app store for those folks? That was their idea. Pretty nice idea. They realized like there should be a demand for building app stores specifically for large enterprise that have natural access to an audience that would want to use an app store. Yeah, it's a pretty fundamental observation, but a nice one. Here's another thing. is every company is going to want a subtly different app store. So it's not like one app store solves every problem. Right? And it's not just like, I want to have my Deutsche Telekom branded app store and Bell wants their Bell. You know, it's not just about that. It's literally, there's subtle differences in our audiences, in our geographies, that mean that we would want to deliver this in a bit of a different way. So that you need a very customized app store. Does what I say kind of make sense so far? So this lays the landscape for what AppDirect does. Now, given the fact that every customer wants a bit of a different app store, and the thing is, it's impossible to really know everything that the customer wants. And by the way, these customers pay like $1 million or more every year to AppDirect for use of the App Store, right? So these are like big ticket customers, right? And so they're paying a lot, they're gonna ask for a lot. They're gonna ask for a lot of customization, right? And so it's really important when AppDirect is building an app store for someone that they really tailor it to their needs and desires as accurately as possible. So with AppDirect, the way I define products is the App Store for Bell, the App Store for Deutsche Telekom, so on and so forth. And for AppDirect, it's so important to combine all the functions together because engineering, I'm not sure if you've ever met an engineer, but I wouldn't trust their judgment on what they think Deutsche Telekom wants. The way that an engineer learns about the nuanced, like product desires of companies in the business world, normal human beings, is basically by getting help from sales and marketing people who are more expert at figuring that out. In fact, it usually happens in 3 stages. You've got the engineer, the product manager, and you've got the sales and marketing. And those things need to be linked together when the customer pays a lot and has very specific needs. Make sense? That's why AppDirect connected themselves that way. Because they knew these groups had to be connected together for them to deliver the right stuff for Bell, for them to deliver the right stuff for Deutsche Telekom. But notice, it isn't just good stuff that comes from this. There is some loss because the fact that Bell and Deutsche Telekom, those groups are kind of separated, means that you'll probably get a lot of reinventing of the wheel. Right? There's something you figured out about Bell that's probably also true about Deutsche Telekom that like some sales, marketing, and engineering folks had to go waste a bit of time to figure out because they didn't know it because that information was stuck on this island. Make sense? Right? So remember, it's a trade-off. No matter how you design it, there's going to be some efficiency gains and some efficiency losses. And you want to try to make a judgment call, which efficiency gains are more important and need to be prioritized, and which ones are less important and can be kind of like, are acceptable in efficiency. You never have a perfect solution here. You're just trying to manage a world of imperfect solutions, right? And so again, AppDirect, the only way for them to justify a really, really big ticket item from their customers who had very idiosyncratic wants and needs was to combine within the product as much as they possibly could. That's a general statement, right? If your customer is unique so that there's a lot of customization and they pay a lot of money, that's going to be a systematic, I think, statement, which is there's going to tend to be this desire to organize by product, to organize divisions by product in this manner. Folks okay with this? So the second example that I think stands in nice contrast to this is the example of Dropbox. So Dropbox organized very differently than AppDirect. And they actually chose to organize but much more by function than by product. So let me explain what product means for Dropbox, because I think it's important to note this. Product 1 is the main product that you think about with Dropbox. right? It's the cloud storage, syncing, and sharing product. All the other products are all the other things that they offer. So at the time, this has changed a bit subsequently, but when they were really kind of starting to scale aggressively, other products that they had were things like they had an email app and a photo app. Like the basic goal of the email app and the photo app was basically those apps, if you downloaded the Dropbox version of them, they would give you email services, they would give you photo services, but they would automatically store that stuff in your Dropbox folder. What's the benefit of Dropbox from that? The users who use those products are likely to hit the edge of the freemium offering more quickly and convert to paid user. Make sense? Well, if you think about things that way, right, the importance of the secondary products, email app, photo app, the importance of this is really about how it augments the value of the primary product, right? The actual storage, syncing, sharing product. And so what that means is you want to make sure that that product jives well with this product. It's all about complementarity with the primary product. And here's another thing. Dropbox customers don't pay as much money as AppDirect customers, $100 a year versus millions of dollars a year. So they can't even ask for customization in the first place. If you, okay, so this might even be funny. It'll show how pathetic I am. But like, I think I mentioned earlier that like the first business hire at Dropbox was a friend of mine from college. And at some point, I just like emailed him out of the blue. I'm like, hey, you know, I want to buy a lifetime membership to Dropbox right now. Just basically I had research money to spend. So I'm like, I'm going to lose it otherwise. So if I could just pay a lifetime on this, that would be great. He didn't even respond to my email. He was probably like, what is Jiro thinking? Right? Like, no way. Like even if someone is saying, I will pay you a lifetime membership, they're still like, no way. We're not going to customize in any way. Because even as a lifetime customer, you're not that valuable. You're not worth the time of entering that in a database, right? Because that actually would take time. You'd probably have to make 10 calls to make that happen, right? No customization, right? And, you know, benefit of hindsight, I now realize how silly it was for me to ask. But in any case, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't remember. He probably deleted it right away. But in any case, yeah, like, this is not a customization market. Since it's not a customization market, it's less critical for there to be really granular and tight communication between sales, marketing, and engineering. It can happen a little bit more informally, kind of outside the boundaries of the official division, right? So settings where your customers are small in terms of how much they pay you every year, and where the customers are more homogeneous, and where one product is really about enhancing other products, those are all settings that are going to tend to shift the optimal organization more towards by function than by product. Notice, like, I think everything I'm saying, once you say it in that way, it kind of makes sense, right? And look, let me be clear. I've kind of cherry picked two examples where the decision is kind of not super subtle. There are, you know, some startups where this is a much more difficult call. I'll also mention another thing. Just comparing this and this is kind of too much of a cartoon. In the real world, you actually see a little bit more of like a hybrid organization. So even with Dropbox, even with AppDirect, right? They went and combined by product for engineering, product, sales, and marketing. But for things like human resources, and even more so for finance, because the communication within the product was less important, they still went and kind of combined kind of a bit more by product than by function than by product, right? So let's keep in mind, like, the decision is more varied than what I'm kind of highlighting with the Dropbox and the AppDirect example. Folks okay with this? All right. I want to discuss in terms of our discussion of phase 3 it's just basically a few other odds and ends that are prominent things that people talk about as phase 3 startup challenges, right? So you're hiring a lot at this stage, and you're making this fundamental challenge of, generalist and flexible to specialized and focused. It helps to have what they say is like, bringing in adults into the organization that have experience with dealing with a more routine focused, process focused organization. And actually, so this becomes the phase where you're most likely to see startups start bringing in seasoned executive leadership into the company. And like, it's not difficult to find examples that justify the statement that I just made. So some examples being, it's really when Facebook is in phase 3 that Sheryl Sandberg gets brought in as COO. Dick Costolo, who used to be at McKinsey, gets brought in as COO of Twitter and eventually becomes their CEO. Dennis Woodside gets brought in for exactly that reason as well at Dropbox. A McGill grad, Alan Black, was brought in again at this stage as CFO of Zendesk, and things like that. It's very clear if you look at the data, right? Companies are bringing in seasoned, serious, high-profile leadership at this stage, not sooner. And the reason for that is twofold. One is the core skill set of seasoned executives tends to be about creating process and efficiency. Doesn't make sense to do that when you're still small and you still don't have a sense of what the right process should be. A little bit similar to that discussion that we had about startup salespeople versus mature salespeople. That same argument kind of holds here, right? And so you don't want to be bringing in these people too early. Another reason you don't want to bring them in too early is because if you bring them in before you've solved go-to-market fit, you will have to give them a big chunk of the company to like justify them accepting your offer. So you'll have to give them like 25% of your company. Meanwhile, if you're like an attractive looking, aggressive, like scaling company, there's a lot less uncertainty now because you've solved go-to-market fit. You may only need to give them 5% of the company, right? So, holding all else equal, I'd rather just dilute myself 5% than 25%, right? So, yeah, that's something that you definitely start seeing at this stage. You also see an increase in transition where people who were at the startup before start leaving and new people are brought in. And it's because the skill set that you needed before is different from the skill set you need now. Some people are able to do the transition, others are not. So you actually have to make a lot of difficult decisions as a startup founder at this stage, where you need to actually decide all these people that were loyal and like took a bet on you and your company when things were so uncertain. You have to actually decide, like, do I keep this person or, do we come up with an arrangement where they leave? Hopefully you don't screw them over, but they still might not be the right person for the job, or they might get demoted, right? And like, there's a lot of, stories where relationships get broken because of that. But like, this is a natural thing that maybe we should expect to happen to some extent at this phase. The other thing I'll mention is that it's really at this phase, I've already alluded to this, that companies really start talking about formalizing processes and also this thing called culture in the company. So processes I already kind of talked about. It's going to be processes like related to hiring and onboarding, related to when communication and how communication across divisions occur. There's so many different things that we could think of as falling into stuff we would want to build process around. And we want to build process because once we build process, it's easier to transfer that knowledge from one person to another, right? And that's what facilitates communication. So that's really important here. If you want to have an interesting kind of story about process around hiring and onboarding, just read up on the story of Zappos, which was e-commerce for shoes, eventually gets acquired by Amazon. I won't hash it here, but that's a story that people generally view as pretty interesting. And also within the context of Netflix for this, you can do a Google search for the Netflix culture deck, which is basically a deck of slides that Netflix gives to potential hires before they actually accept a job offer from Netflix. to make sure that they're a good culture fit for their organization. Because as I said, Netflix does things culturally a little bit different from other places. That's one of the things that Reed Hastings is known for. But the last thing I'm going to say is this thing called culture. I won't say much about it, mainly because I still don't understand it, but I feel like I understand it a little bit more than I did when I first started learning about startups and about VC. But culture is something that like pretty much everyone who's been through the startup experience, managing, running a startup in this hectic phase, everyone who's been through it talks about culture. And culture is one of these things people talk a lot about, and there's not a lot of clarity around it. In fact, there's this great quote by Drew Houston. He's one of the co-founders, still CEO of Dropbox. He has this nice statement where he was saying, look, people were telling, he had a bunch of mentors early on as Dropbox was becoming a high-profile company. And he's like, look, I met with several of these kind of ex-founders and stuff like that, and they were telling me about this culture thing. And at first I was like, what the hell are these people talking about? I'm just going to disregard this thing they talked about culture because it was too fluffy for me to understand what it meant. And then he was like, but at some point when I met the 15th person who's been through this in the past, and he was also the 15th person to mention culture, I started thinking maybe this is important and I just really don't understand it and really need to start reading up on it and trying to understand it and trying to focus on things that are more than just rational do task A, but more kind of people management and stuff like that to get everyone to work well together on a common goal. So what I'll say is most people, especially folks who are a bit more technical and nerdy, do have a tendency to not really naturally understand what culture means. Maybe I'll give one definition that tends to resonate with at least nerds like myself, which is one view of culture is it's everything that you do within your organization whose goals are basically to get your employees to be able to guess what roughly the right decision to make is for the organization, even when they don't have all the necessary information to make that decision, and when you're not available to answer it for them. So anything that you would view as being something that can help that objective, you could probably classify as falling under the umbrella term culture. And so I would recommend for people who are interested in startups, both as an investor and founder and employee and executive, start keeping track of that. Start keeping track of all the stories you hear where the story that's being told to you by someone who's lived through something like this actually seems to say something, uncover a little wrinkle on that broad overarching umbrella. The things you do to get employees to make the right decisions with limited information when you're not around to define all the details of the objective for them. I think people who have a lot of clarity and awareness and can explain decisions they make on that dimension, I would say are probably the folks that you can learn the most from on culture. Because again, my view is culture is not an easy thing for us to naturally understand because it's not formulaic, right? So I'll leave it at that. Companies are trying to figure out culture. I'm not a culture expert, so I don't want to try to say too much. It would be kind of pathetic. So I'll just leave it as that. Just know that a lot of people talk a lot about it, so that you probably want to learn through it, but more outside of my class than inside of my class, in terms of trying to put yourself in a position to maximize your likelihood of success, at least in one vertical of this startup ecosystem in the future. Sound good? All right, so this wraps up the topic 1, part 2. So our discussion of the life cycle. This Thursday's lecture, I think, as I've mentioned before, and as is noted on the syllabus, is not going to be a live session, and so it's going to be recorded. I'm going to in that session post basically about 2 things. One is a discussion of the funding life cycle and exit basics. And then the other one is going to be an all of a sudden slightly streamlined discussion of VC firms, VC funds, and the evaluation, like how you evaluate whether VCs are good or bad. I had initially planned to do that a bit more technical, but I'm actually going to streamline that in the interest of time for this course, because I've heard from people that they don't want 7 hours of videos every week or something like that, which I can kind of understand. So I'll do a streamline. If there's one place where it makes practical sense to streamline content, it's exactly where I'm streamlining, because this aspect of like understanding a bunch of technical things around venture firms, venture funds, and evaluating those firms and funds, that's actually the kind of thing that you would only be asked in your career to do kind of 10 to 15 years into your career, as opposed to at the beginning of your career. So if there's one where you have more luxury of time to learn something about, it's that. So I feel it's kind of less critical for me to, make sure you learn it right now. Okay? All right, you guys all look very tired, so I'm gonna let you go. Hopefully this was useful at least. And I will see you guys. I don't remember. I'm not sure if we have a live lecture next Tuesday or not. I'd have to look at the syllabus. I just don't remember. But the syllabus will tell you. Whatever the syllabus says, I'm still sticking to right now. Okay? All right. So I hope everyone has a nice remainder of the week and upcoming weekend. And we'll see you guys at some point in the future. All right? I can stick around for a little bit if anyone has questions or stuff like that.
Thank you.